You bring nothing to this family." The words hung in the air of the Wilsons' perfectly decorated dining room, Susan Wilson's voice cutting through the Thanksgiving dinner conversation like a knife. My mother-in-law hadn't even bothered to lower her voice as she locked eyes with me across the table, crystal glasses and fine china suddenly silent witnesses to my public humiliation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My husband Mark shifted uncomfortably beside me but said nothing, his silence more damning than any words could be. I felt 20 pairs of eyes burning into me as I sat frozen, the half-eaten pumpkin pie turning to ash in my mouth. If only they knew that just yesterday, I had signed off on the acquisition that would save Midwest Distribution Solutions from bankruptcy, the $40 million family business they all believed was thriving under George Wilson's leadership. If only they knew that I was the silent power keeping their legacy and livelihoods intact. But they didn't know. And as I excused myself from the table, legs shaking beneath my carefully selected dress, I wondered if they ever would. 5 years. Earlier, I was Laura Davis, a promising financial analyst at Cranston Partners in Chicago. My specialty was rescuing struggling mid-sized companies, restructuring their operations, and turning their balance sheets from red to black. I worked 80-hour weeks, lived on takeout and determination, and had just been put on the partnership track, the youngest woman in the firm's history to achieve that recognition. "You're wasted on these smaller accounts, Laura," my mentor Diane had told me over late-night Thai food in the office. "But you've got a gift for seeing value where others see only liabilities." I had smiled, exhausted but satisfied. Numbers had always made sense to me in a way people often didn't. Spreadsheets didn't play games. Balance sheets didn't lie. In the financial world, I knew exactly where I stood. Then I met Mark Wilson at a charity gala I'd been dragged to by colleagues. Handsome, charming, and seemingly down-to-earth despite coming from one of Chicago's oldest business families. He pursued me with a determination that broke through my carefully constructed walls. After years of prioritizing my career over relationships, I found myself falling for his easy smile and the way he listened when I spoke. Our courtship was a whirlwind, weekends at his family's Lake Geneva home, dinners at restaurants where the staff knew his name, impromptu trips to New York just because he wanted to show me the sunrise from his favorite rooftop. 6 months after, we met. He proposed on a private yacht on Lake Michigan, the Chicago skyline glittering behind us like a backdrop of stars. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met," he'd whispered against my hair. "You're brilliant and beautiful and real. I want to build a life with you, Laura." I said yes, swept up in the romance and possibility of our future together. That night, as we celebrated with champagne, I couldn't have known I was stepping into a world where old money talked and everyone else was expected to listen. I couldn't have known how quickly I would go from being Laura Davis, rising star, to simply Mark's wife. The first dinner with his family should have been my warning. We gathered at his parents' Winnetka estate, a sprawling property with manicured gardens and lake views that spoke of generational wealth. "So, you work in finance?" George Wilson had asked, swirling his scotch with barely concealed disinterest. "Laura's being modest, Dad." Mark jumped in before I could answer. "She's brilliant with numbers, one of the top analysts at her firm." "How unusual," Susan had commented with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I always imagined Mark with someone more traditional. "Someone more like Elise Thornton," his sister Stephanie had added, naming the daughter of another prominent Chicago family. "She just became the director of her family's foundation. Such important work, and it still leaves time for family priorities." The conversation had shifted then, leaving me behind like an awkward footnote. Throughout the evening, I'd caught Susan studying me when she thought I wasn't looking, as if assessing a purchase she wasn't sure about returning. Later that night, Mark had kissed away my concerns. "They're just protective," he'd explained. "The family business is everything. To them, Dad started with one truck and built an empire. It's hard for them to understand people who aren't part of that legacy. I should have recognized then how he separated me from them. People like you, people like us. But love has a way of blurring the warning signals. The wedding was lavish, featured in Chicago social pages, and largely planned by Susan and her team of coordinators. My input was nominally requested, then systematically ignored. My parents, a high school chemistry teacher and a nurse from Grand Rapids, looked uncomfortable among the Wilsons' friends and business associates. "Just let her handle it," Mark advised when I expressed frustration about the growing guest list filled with people I'd never met. "Mom lives for this stuff, and it makes her happy to see me settled with the right kind of wedding." I'd swallowed my objections, telling myself it was just one day, that what mattered was our life together afterward. Besides, I was busy with a particularly challenging client at work, a transportation company hemorrhaging money through an outdated logistics system. The irony that this was similar to Mark's family business wasn't lost on me, though I knew better than to mention it. After the honeymoon, 2 perfect weeks in the Greek islands, we settled into a penthouse condo Mark had purchased near the lake, and I returned to my position at Cranston Partners. For a few months, we existed in what I now recognize as the eye of the storm. Calm, deceptively normal, while pressure systems gathered force around us. The first squall hit 6 months into our marriage. I'd just successfully completed the transportation company turnaround, saving them from bankruptcy and earning a substantial bonus in the process. Mark suggested we celebrate with dinner at Alinea, and over dessert, he casually mentioned that his father had been asking when I planned to settle into married life. "What does that even mean?" I asked, setting down my spoon. Mark looked uncomfortable. Maybe think about scaling back at work, starting a family, that kind of thing." We agreed we'd wait at least 2 years before even discussing children. I reminded him, "And I'm up for junior partner next quarter." I know, he said, reaching for my hand. "And I'm proud of you. It's just, that's not really how things work in my family. The Wilson women have always focused on supporting their husbands and raising the next generation. Mom's already hinting about grandchildren." "Mark, I'm not quitting my job to have babies on your mother's schedule." He'd laughed then, diffusing the tension. "Of course not. I'm just passing along the message. We'll do things our way." But the conversation lingered like a paper cut, small but persistently painful. Over the next few months, the pressure increased. Sunday dinners at Winnetka became exercises in diplomatic deflection as Susan probed about my work hours, my reproductive plans, my commitment to Wilson family traditions. "Laura's career is important to her right now," Mark would interject, as if my ambition were a phase I would outgrow. Meanwhile, at work, I was assigned to a new client, a family-owned business struggling with cash flow issues and outdated systems. I threw myself into the project, grateful for the familiar territory of spreadsheets and projections where my value wasn't questioned. One evening, working late, I noticed the company name on a document I hadn't seen before. Midwest Distribution Holdings, the parent company of Midwest Distribution Solutions, Mark's family business. I confronted him that night. "Did you know Cranston Partners took on your family's company as a client?" He looked genuinely surprised. "What? No, Dad would never agree to outside consultants. He's too proud." "Well, someone in your family did. The paperwork came through last week." Mark immediately called his father, putting him on speaker in our kitchen. "Of course I didn't hire consultants," George had said irritably. "We're having a temporary cash flow issue because of the expansion into Wisconsin. Nothing serious." But his voice held something I recognized from countless other business owners in trouble, a mixture of denial and fear. The next day, I discreetly reviewed the files. What I found alarmed me. Midwest Distribution was not experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. They were potentially months away from insolvency. Years of outdated systems, poor inventory management, and an ill-advised expansion had created a perfect storm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The business that had supported the Wilson lifestyle for 2 generations was on the verge of collapse. Protocol dictated I should recuse myself due to the conflict of interest. Instead, I requested a private meeting with my direct supervisor. "I want to lead this account," I told him, "but with a condition: my involvement remains confidential, even from the client." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "That's highly irregular, Laura." "So is the fact that my father-in-law apparently doesn't know his company engaged our services. Someone else in the business made this decision, and they did it because they recognize what I can see in these numbers. This company needs help, and I'm uniquely positioned to provide it." After some back and forth, we reached an agreement. I would work on the Midwest distribution account under a project code name. My analysis and recommendations would be presented by Anthony, with no mention of my involvement. It was unorthodox, but not unethical, and it might be the only way to save my husband's family legacy without triggering George Wilson's pride. That night marked the beginning of my double life. By day, I continued my regular client load. By night, I dissected Midwest Distribution's operations, identifying inefficiencies, outdated processes, and opportunities for genuine transformation. I discovered that Brian, Mark's brother who officially served as CFO, had been the one to engage. Cranston Partners, a desperate move from someone watching his birthright crumble. What I couldn't tell anyone was how personal this felt. Every dinner at Winnetka now came with new layers of irony as Susan commented on my long work hours, or George complained about modern business practices ruining the personal touch. If only they knew I was working to save the very foundation of their privileged lives. Mark noticed my increased workload, but attributed it to my upcoming partnership review. "Don't work yourself to death," he'd say, kissing my forehead as he left for his much shorter day at the family business, where he held the title of Vice President of Client Relations, a position that seemed to primarily involve golf and expensive lunches. 3 months into the secret project, Anthony presented my recommendations to the Midwest Distribution executive team. I had crafted a complete restructuring plan, modernizing their logistics software, consolidating warehouses, renegotiating vendor contracts, and implementing efficiency measures that would cut costs without sacrificing quality. The plan was met with resistance from George, but enthusiastic support from Brian and the non-family executives. They began implementing changes incrementally, each one nudging their financial outlook from critical to merely serious. Meanwhile, the dynamic with Mark's family grew increasingly strained. Susan's comments about my commitment to the marriage became less veiled. Stephanie openly discussed fertility specialists she knew, despite my never having mentioned any reproductive challenges. At one particularly uncomfortable dinner, George had pontificated about women who think they can have it all, while staring directly at me. "They're just old-fashioned," Mark continued to excuse, growing irritated with my decreasing tolerance. "Can't you make more of an effort?" "I'm making plenty of effort," I replied, unable to tell him that my evenings were spent saving his family's company rather than learning his grandmother's secret recipes or attending charity luncheons with his mother. The strain began showing in our marriage. Mark couldn't understand why I was growing distant, and I couldn't explain without revealing my involvement with Midwest Distribution. We argued more frequently about my work hours, about his family's expectations, about the children we weren't having. The warm partnership I'd envisioned when accepting his proposal felt increasingly like a transaction where I was failing to deliver my end of an unwritten contract. 9 months into the Midwest Distribution project, a crisis emerged. Their largest client threatened to pull their business, a move that would sink the company despite all our restructuring efforts. I spent 3 sleepless nights crafting an emergency intervention plan, then watched from the sidelines as Anthony presented it in an emergency board meeting. The plan worked. The client stayed. And suddenly, Midwest Distribution's outlook shifted, from survival to potential growth. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. My husband was growing more distant. His family treated me with thinly veiled disdain. And I was pouring my expertise into saving a company whose owner openly dismissed women with career ambitions. When my partnership review came, I received the promotion I'd worked years for. Mark attended the celebration dinner but seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just business stuff," he replied vaguely. "Dad's excited about some turnaround at the company. Apparently, we're doing better than expected." I bit my tongue, swallowing both pride and resentment with my champagne. That night, lying awake beside my sleeping husband, I made a decision. If I was going to continue saving Midwest Distribution, I wanted more than anonymous influence. I wanted a seat at the table. The next day, I approached Anthony with a proposal. Cranston Partners would create a shell investment company with me as the primary stakeholder. This entity would offer Midwest Distribution a capital infusion in exchange for a controlling interest. On paper, it would appear to be an angel investor with strategic expertise in logistics. In reality, it would be me. "This is crossing a line, Laura," Anthony warned. "Maybe," I acknowledged. "But I've spent nearly a year saving this company while being treated like an inconvenient accessory by the family that owns it. I've earned this." After much discussion and careful legal review, we proceeded. The investment offer was presented to Midwest Distribution's board with terms too attractive to refuse given their still precarious position. George Wilson initially resisted selling control, but Brian, who knew exactly how close they'd come to bankruptcy, convinced him it was their only path forward. 2 weeks later, papers were signed. Midwest Distribution Solutions remained intact, with the Wilson family retaining significant ownership. But control had shifted to an investment entity called LD Strategic Partners, my initials hidden in plain sight. I was now effectively George Wilson's boss, though he had no idea. In the months that followed, the company's performance improved dramatically as my strategies were fully implemented. The Wilson family lifestyle continued uninterrupted, funded by a business they didn't realize had slipped from their grasp. Mark noticed my improved mood, but attributed it to my partnership at Cranston. Our marriage stabilized somewhat, though the fundamental disconnects remained. Susan's campaign to convert me into a proper Wilson wife continued unabated. Each family gathering brought new passive-aggressive comments, new comparisons to more suitable women, new questions about when I would settle down properly. I endured these with a private smile, knowing I now controlled the purse strings of their entitled existence. Which brings me to that Thanksgiving dinner, 2 years into my secret arrangement, when Susan Wilson, secure in her magnificently catered dining room surrounded by family who never questioned her value, looked me in the eye and declared that I brought nothing to their family. The irony might have been comical if it hadn't been so painful. As the Wilson family enjoyed their pumpkin pie, not one of them realized that the woman they dismissed as a career-obsessed outsider was the only reason they still had a dining room to gather in, silver to eat with, or a family business to complain about. I excused myself from the table, legs shaking with suppressed emotion. In the guest bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. Laura Davis Wilson, partner at a prestigious consulting firm, controlling owner of a $40 million company, and somehow still not good enough for the family whose livelihood I preserved. Something shifted inside me as I stood there, water dripping from my chin. A lifetime of proving myself, of working twice as hard for recognition, of swallowing insults with a polite smile. And for what? For a husband who remained silent while his mother belittled me? For the hollow victory of secretly controlling a company whose values I increasingly questioned? I dried my face with a monogrammed hand towel, WM for Wilson Manor, the pretentious name Susan had given to their Winnetka estate. Then I took out my phone and sent a text to Brian, the only family member who knew of my involvement with the company. We need to talk, tomorrow, 9 a.m. at my office. When I returned to the dining room, conversations had moved on. No one apologized. No one even acknowledged what had happened. Mark squeezed my hand under the table, his standard response to his family's behavior. Too little, too late. As dessert concluded and coffee was served, George raised a toast to family traditions and the Wilson legacy. His booming voice filled with the confidence of a man who believes he remains firmly at the helm of his own destiny. I raised my glass with the others, a plan already forming in my mind. Tomorrow would bring a disruption to the Wilson family narrative. Tomorrow, I would stop hiding in the shadows of their dismissal. Tomorrow, they would learn exactly what I brought to the family. The guest room at Winnetka felt suffocating that night. Mark had fallen asleep quickly, slightly drunk on expensive wine and the comfort of family tradition. I lay awake beside him, watching shadows move across the ceiling from passing cars outside. We were staying the night at his parents' insistence. Wilson family tradition that felt more like an obligation with each passing year. The mattress was perfectly firm, the sheets Egyptian cotton with an obscene thread count, the room temperature precisely controlled. Everything in Susan Wilson's home was calibrated for comfort, yet I'd never felt more out of place. By 6 a.m., I'd given up on sleep entirely. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Mark, and changed into the running clothes I'd packed. The house was silent as I made my way downstairs, past walls adorned with Wilson family photographs documenting generations of success and celebration. I noted with some bitterness how few of these images included me, despite 3 years of marriage. The November air hit my lungs like ice water as I stepped outside, exactly what I needed to clear my head. I set off down the tree-lined streets of Winnetka, past other enormous homes sheltering other wealthy families. For 3 miles, I pushed myself harder than usual, as if I could somehow outrun the decision looming before me. By the time I returned, sweaty and slightly calmer, activity had begun stirring in the house. I showered quickly, dressed in the business attire I'd packed just in case, and made my way to the kitchen where Susan was already directing the housekeeper about leftover management. "You're up early," she observed, her tone suggesting this was somehow inconvenient. "And dressed for work? On Black Friday?" "I have a meeting downtown," I replied, helping myself to coffee from the elaborate machine that required an engineering degree to operate. "On a holiday weekend? That firm really does own you, doesn't it?" The familiar disapproval tinged her voice. "Mark mentioned you'd both stay through Sunday for the charity gala." "Plans change," I said simply, unwilling to engage in the usual battle this early. "Is Mark up yet?" "George took him and Brian to the club for breakfast. Some of their old school friends are in town." She adjusted a flower arrangement that already looked perfect. "You know how boys are. They need their time." Boys. Mark and Brian were 34 and 36 respectively, yet in this house they remained perpetual children, coddled and excused from adult responsibilities like communicating with their spouses about breakfast plans. I checked my watch, 7:30 a.m. My meeting with Brian was scheduled for 9 p.m. "Could you let Mark know I had to go into the office? I'll text him later." Susan's lips thinned with disapproval. Family time used to mean something. In my day, wives understood priorities. The comment was so typical, so predictable in its outdated expectations that it barely registered as offensive anymore. Yesterday, it would have slid off me, added to the mountain of small cuts I had learned to ignore. Today, with the weight of my pending decision pressing down, I found myself responding. "And what priorities would those be, Susan?" The priority of pretending everything is perfect while problems pile up behind closed doors? The priority of keeping women decorative rather than functional? Or the priority of maintaining appearances regardless of reality? Her eyes widened, coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. In 3 years, I had never directly challenged her. The Wilson way was polite deflection, changing subjects, pretending conflicts didn't exist. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing," I said, gathering my bag and keys. "Just thinking out loud about priorities." I left her standing there, confusion replacing her usual certainty. The small act of resistance felt surprisingly good, a preview of the larger confrontation to come. The drive into Chicago gave me time to organize my thoughts. Traffic was light on the holiday, the city still sleeping off its collective turkey coma. My office building stood quiet when I arrived, just a skeleton, security staff and a few other workaholics who nodded in silent solidarity as we rode the elevator. I spent the next hour reviewing documents and figures, confirming what I already knew. Under my guidance, Midwest Distribution Solutions had not merely survived, but begun to thrive. We had streamlined operations, modernized systems, expanded into more profitable service lines, and most importantly, stabilized cash flow. The Wilson family had reaped the benefits of these improvements without acknowledging, or even knowing, their source. At precisely 9 a.m., my assistant, who deserved a substantial holiday bonus for coming in today, showed Brian Wilson into my office. Unlike his brother, Brian had inherited their mother's leaner build and sharper features. He also possessed something Mark and George conspicuously lacked, a genuine understanding of business fundamentals. "Laura," he said, accepting my offered handshake with visible anxiety. "Your message sounded urgent." "Have a seat." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, rather than the more casual seating area. This conversation required the formality of distance. "I'll get right to the point. Yesterday, your mother informed me and everyone at Thanksgiving dinner that I bring nothing to the Wilson family." Brian winced. "I heard about that. Mom was out of line." Was she? Or was she simply expressing what the family collectively believes? I opened a folder on my desk. "Tell me, Brian, how much does your father think Midwest Distribution Solutions is worth right now?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Dad thinks we're positioned at around $40 million, give or take. The last 2 years have been transformative." "And why does he think that transformation occurred?" He credits the consultants from Cranston, and himself, of course. Dad believes he made all the right decisions by approving the recommendations. Brian looked down at his hands. He has no idea those recommendations came from you specifically. "And you've never told him." "We had an agreement," he said defensively. "You wanted your involvement kept confidential. I've respected that." "Yes, we did have an agreement." I slid a document across to him. "And then we had another agreement, when LD Strategic Partners acquired controlling interest in Midwest Distribution. An agreement your father signed without ever asking who actually owns LD Strategic." Brian picked up the paper, though he hardly needed to review it. He had been the one to convince George to accept the deal when the company had been on the brink of collapse. "I've kept your secret, Laura, even from Mark." His voice held a question. "And I've appreciated that. But things have changed." I leaned forward. "I'm tired of being treated like an unwelcome appendage to the Wilson family, while secretly being the reason that family can maintain its lifestyle. I'm tired of enduring condescension from people whose financial security rests in my hands." "What are you planning to do?" The question hung between us, heavy with implication. Brian, more than anyone, understood exactly how much power I held. If I chose to, I could dismantle the Wilson empire piece by piece. I could sell assets, restructure management, even liquidate divisions. George Wilson had signed away his absolute authority with a flourish, never suspecting that control had passed not to some anonymous investment group, but to his dismissed daughter-in-law. I'm planning to tell the truth, I said simply. All of it. Today. The color drained from Brian's face. Laura, please reconsider. Dad's heart is perfectly fine according to his last physical, I cut in, and his pride will survive too. It's not just Dad. This will affect all of us. It already has affected all of you. You've been benefiting from my expertise for years while watching your family treat me like an inconvenient accessory. Did you speak up yesterday when your mother humiliated me? Did anyone? His silence was answer enough. I've called a family meeting for noon today. As controlling partner of Midwest Distribution, I have that authority. I've already informed your father's assistant that his presence is non-negotiable. Does Mark know? Brian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Not yet. This was the one aspect of my plan that still twisted in my stomach. My husband would be blindsided along with the rest of them. He'll find out with everyone else. Brian studied me for a long moment. You know this will change everything. That's exactly the point. After he left, I sat alone in my office, watching Chicago fully awaken below. Doubts crept in at the edges of my resolve. Was I being vindictive? Was this about justice or simply retribution for years of subtle degradation? Did I actually want to blow up my marriage along with the carefully maintained Wilson family mythology? These questions circled as I gathered materials for the meeting, organizing financial reports and legal documents into a presentation that would leave no room for denial. By 11:30, when I left for the Midwest Distribution headquarters 6 blocks away, my determination had hardened again. The company occupied 3 floors of a renovated industrial building in Chicago's West Loop. The reception area displayed the Wilson Distribution logo prominently, a stylized W with a horizon line meant to evoke open roads and endless possibility. George had designed it himself 30 years earlier, a fact he mentioned at every opportunity. I nodded to the security guard in reception. Staff who recognized me from previous visits as Mark's wife, rather than the actual owner of the company. The conference room on the top floor had been prepared as requested, copies of my presentation placed at each seat, the company's financial history displayed on the wall screen, water and coffee service arranged on the sideboard. I arrived first, intentionally. Standing at the head of the table, I watched the door as Wilson family members arrived in clusters. Stephanie and her husband David entered first, surprise registering when they saw me. Brian arrived, looking pale and tense, avoiding eye contact. Mark's Uncle Richard and Aunt Karen followed, then various cousins and Stephanie's teenage children who held minor symbolic roles in the family business. Mark and his parents arrived last. George Wilson entered the room like he owned it, which he still believed he did, his tall frame straight despite his 65 years, silver hair perfectly groomed. Susan followed, her expression souring when she spotted me at the head of the table. Mark looked confused, eyes darting between me and his father. Laura, what are you doing here? Mark asked, moving toward me with a puzzled smile. I thought you had a meeting at your office. I did, I confirmed. With Brian. Now I'm having one with all of you. George cleared his throat impatiently. Brian said there was an urgent situation with our investors. I don't see why Laura needs to be present for that. Because I am your investor, I stated, flatly, watching the words land like stones in still water. Please, everyone take a seat. We have a lot to cover. Confusion rippled through the room. Mark stood frozen halfway between me and his family, uncertainty written across his features. What are you talking about? George demanded, remaining standing even as others reluctantly took seats. I met his gaze directly. LD Strategic Partners, the investment group that acquired controlling interest in Midwest Distribution Solutions 2 years ago, is my company. I created it specifically to save this business when it was 3 months away from complete collapse. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only when Susan let out a disbelieving laugh. That's ridiculous. Is it? I clicked the remote, bringing the screen to life with a timeline of the company's financial history. In September 3 years ago, Midwest Distribution was hemorrhaging cash due to outdated systems, poor inventory management, and an ill-advised expansion into Wisconsin. Brian recognized the severity of the situation and secretly engaged Cranston, Partners, my firm, for consultation. All eyes turned to Brian, who looked miserable but nodded in confirmation. The recommendations that turned this company around, the logistics software implementation, warehouse consolidation, vendor contract renegotiations, those came from me. I developed the entire restructuring plan while working nights and weekends, all while being treated as an outsider at family dinners. George's face had turned an alarming shade of red. This is absurd. I never would have agreed. You didn't know, I cut in, because Brian understood your pride wouldn't allow you to accept help from your daughter-in-law. So I worked anonymously, my strategies presented by others. And when the company still needed capital to survive, I created LD Strategic to provide it. I handed out copies of the acquisition agreement, George's flamboyant signature highlighted. At the bottom, you signed control of this company over to me, George. For the past 2 years, every major decision at Midwest Distribution has required my approval, whether you realized it or not. Mark finally found his voice, shock evident in every word. Laura, why wouldn't you tell me any of this? I turned to my husband, the hardest part of this confrontation. For the same reason I couldn't tell your father. You've never taken my career seriously. You've positioned yourself as the buffer between me and your family's expectations, but you've never actually challenged those expectations. You've watched your mother belittle my choices for years without real objection. That's not fair, he protested weakly. Isn't it? Yesterday your mother announced to an entire table of people that I bring nothing to this family. Your response was to squeeze my hand under the table. Not to defend me, not to point out that I'm a partner at one of the most prestigious consulting firms in Chicago. Just silent complicity. Susan had recovered enough to go on the offensive. This is preposterous. Whatever game you're playing, Laura. It's not a game, I interrupted, sliding financial statements in front of her. These are Midwest Distribution's current valuations. The company that was worth perhaps $15 million 3 years ago, though, even that was optimistic given the debt load, is now legitimately valued at $40 million. That transformation happened under my direction. George had finally sunk into a chair, scanning the documents with growing comprehension. He might have begun the company with limited education, but 30 years of business had taught him to read financial statements. The truth was undeniable in the columns of figures before him. Why reveal this now? He asked, his bombastic certainty noticeably diminished. Because I'm tired of the contradiction. I'm tired of secretly directing this company's future while being treated as if my career is some sort of self-indulgent hobby. I'm tired of watching the Wilson family enjoy the fruits of my labor while simultaneously dismissing my value. The room fell silent again as the magnitude of the revelation settled. Stephanie was whispering frantically to her husband. The younger cousins looked bewildered. Brian stared at the table, avoiding everyone's eyes. Mark moved slowly to the chair, beside mine, his face a complicated mix of emotions. All this time you've been working to save my family's company without anyone knowing? Yes. Why? Why go to such lengths in secret? It was the question I'd asked myself repeatedly over the past 2 years. The answer had evolved as my resentment grew, but the core remained the same. Initially, because I loved you and knew how important the family legacy was to you. Later, because I'd invested too much to walk away. And honestly, because it became a challenge to see if I could transform a failing company while its owners remained oblivious to who was actually in charge. This is a betrayal of trust, Susan declared, finding her voice again. Going behind the family's back, making decisions without proper consultation. No, Susan, I cut her off firmly. The proper consultation happened. Just because you didn't know I was the one making recommendations doesn't change their validity. The betrayal of trust was never mine. It was all of you consistently undervaluing and dismissing me while I worked to preserve your way of life. George had been unusually quiet, still reviewing the financial documents. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his expression. The bluster had faded, replaced by a shrewd assessment I'd never seen him direct at me before. "You actually did all this?" he asked, gesturing to the growth charts displayed on screen. "I did. Without taking credit. Until now." He nodded, slowly, as if seeing me for the first time. "That's impressive. Misguided and unnecessarily complicated, but impressive." It wasn't an apology, but from George Wilson, it was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever received. The room's atmosphere shifted slightly, uncertainty replacing outright hostility. "So what happens now?" Mark asked, his voice quiet. "You own the family business. Where does that leave us? The family? Our marriage?" The question hung in the air, the one I'd been avoiding even in my own mind. What did I actually want from this confrontation? Revenge? Recognition? Reconciliation? I'd been so focused on the revelation itself that I hadn't fully mapped out its aftermath. "That depends," I said finally, looking around the table at the assembled Wilson family, "on whether this revelation changes anything fundamental. I didn't take control of Midwest distribution to destroy it, or the family connected to it. I did it because it needed saving, and because I had the skills to make that happen." "Are you planning to sell?" George asked bluntly, businessman to businessman. "I could," I acknowledged. "The company is worth substantially more now than when I acquired control. But that was never my goal." "Then what do you want?" Susan asked, a different note in her voice, confusion rather than condemnation. "Respect," I said simply. "Recognition of my value, both professionally and personally. A true place in this family, not as an accessory or an inconvenience, but as a contributing member with skills and perspective worth acknowledging." Mark reached for my hand across the table, the same gesture he'd offered at Thanksgiving, but somehow different in this new context. "I had no idea what you were doing. All this time, I thought you were just focused on making partner." "I was doing that too," I pointed out. "I've managed to build my career and save your family business simultaneously. Imagine what might have been possible if I'd had actual support instead of constant undermining." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of my words sank in. Decades of Wilson family dynamics had been upended in the span of 30 minutes. The power balance had shifted irrevocably, and no one quite knew how to proceed. Finally, somewhat surprisingly, it was Stephanie who spoke. "Mom, Dad, she's right." All eyes turned to Mark's sister, usually the most vocal defender of Wilson family traditions. "We've been awful to Laura from the beginning. We decided who she should be without ever seeing who she actually is." Susan looked stricken, her carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal genuine confusion. "We only wanted what was best for the family." "No," I corrected gently. "You wanted what was most comfortable for the family, what fit your preconceptions and traditions. That's not the same thing." George cleared his throat, clearly struggling with how to proceed. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he wasn't the most powerful person in the room. "The company is legally yours now. What are your intentions?" It was a businessman's question, and I appreciated the directness. "My intention is to continue Midwest Distribution's growth trajectory. The company has potential that's only beginning to be realized, but moving forward, I'll be doing so openly, not from the shadows." "And our roles?" Brian asked, speaking up for the first time since the meeting began. "That depends on your performance and contribution, just like any executive team," I said. "George, You built this company from nothing. That knowledge and history have value. Brian, your financial acumen has been crucial even if your communication strategies were questionable. There are roles for both of you, but on different terms than before. And what about me? Mark asked quietly. The personal question hidden within the business discussion. What about us? What about our marriage? Could it survive this seismic shift? That's a separate conversation, I said, not unkindly. One we need to have privately. George nodded, businessman to businessman again. We'll need time to process all this. Of course, but the company doesn't stop for family drama. I stood, gathering my materials. I've scheduled meetings with the executive team on Monday to discuss the management transition. Until then, operations continue as normal. As the family filed out in stunned silence, each avoiding my gaze in their own way, Mark remained seated. When the door closed behind the last cousin, he exhaled heavily. 3 years, he said, shaking his head. 3 years of marriage, and I had no idea what you were capable of. You never asked, I replied simply. You never really wanted to know. That's not true, he protested, but without conviction. Mark, when was the last time you asked me about my work? Not just, how was your day, but actually engaged with what I do and why it matters to me. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to recall such a conversation. We need to decide if we have a marriage worth saving, I continued, gathering my courage. Not a Wilson family arrangement where I play a predetermined role, but an actual partnership between equals. Is that what you want? He asked, uncertainty evident in his voice. To stay married? After all this? The question cut to the heart of my own ambivalence. Did I want to salvage a relationship built on such fundamental misconceptions? Was there anything beneath the surface worth preserving? I don't know, I admitted. I love you, Mark. I always have. But I don't know if you've ever really seen me, the actual me, not the version your family expected or the one you thought you married. That's what we need to figure out. He nodded slowly, processing. Where are you going now? Home. Our home, not your parents' house. I need some space to think. And I imagine your family needs you right now. You're my family too, he said, the word sounding almost like a question. Am I? That's what we need to decide. I left him sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of my professional triumph and our personal disconnect. The elevator ride down felt like descending from one life into the possibility of another, the future suddenly unwritten in ways I hadn't permitted myself to imagine before. Outside, Chicago had fully awakened, the streets busy with Black Friday shoppers hunting bargains. I joined the flow of pedestrians, anonymous among the crowds, no longer defined by my connection to the Wilson name or confined by their expectations. For the first time in years, I felt truly, completely myself. Laura Davis, financial strategist, company savior, woman at a crossroads. The revelation had been necessary, cathartic even, but it was only the beginning. The harder work lay ahead, deciding what to preserve and what to leave behind, what to build and what to demolish. As I walked home through the crisp November air, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. Whatever came next would be my choice. Not a role assigned to me, not a compromise made to keep peace, but a path I would determine with full awareness of my own worth and capabilities. The Wilson family now knew exactly what I brought to the table. The question remaining was whether they, especially Mark, could adapt to that reality, or if we were all better off going our separate ways. By the time I reached our lakefront condo, I had no answers, only a peculiar sense of lightness. The weight of secrets had lifted, replaced by the more manageable burden of honest uncertainty. I kicked off my shoes at the door, made myself a cup of tea, and settled by the window overlooking the water. Let them talk among themselves, process the shock, adjust to the new reality. I had carried Midwest distribution and the Wilson family legacy for years without recognition. Now it was their turn to shoulder the weight of truth while I took a moment to simply breathe, unencumbered by pretense for the first time since saying, I do. The weekend passed in a strange limbo. Mark didn't come home Friday night, and I didn't. Call to ask where he was staying. Saturday morning, I woke to an empty condo and the realization that this might be my new normal. Quiet spaces without the constant background hum of Wilson family expectations. The thought brought both anxiety and relief, like removing a splinter that had been embedded so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to be without the persistent ache. I spent the day cleaning out my home office, a symbolic gesture that felt necessary. For too long, I'd kept my professional life compartmentalized, files and documents hidden away as if my success were something shameful. I rearranged furniture, hung my Cranston partnership certificate prominently on the wall, and placed family photos, my family, the Davises, not the Wilsons, on the desk where I could see them. My parents smiling from their modest backyard in Grand Rapids. My sister and her kids at the lake last summer. Reminders of where I came from, the values that had shaped me before I entered the Wilson orbit. By evening, my phone had accumulated. 12 missed calls, from Mark, from Brian, even one from George that I'd never have expected. I wasn't ready to talk to any of them. Instead, I called the person who had known me longer than anyone in Chicago. "This is unexpected," Diane said when she answered. My mentor at Cranston had been the one to recommend me for partnership, the one who'd seen my potential from the beginning. Saturday night calls are usually emergencies or drunk dials. Which is this? Neither, or maybe both. I cradled the phone against my shoulder as I poured a glass of wine. Can we talk? 20 minutes later, we were seated at a corner table in Avec, a wine bar quiet enough for conversation but public enough to discourage emotional outbursts. Diane listened without interruption as I detailed the past 3 years. The secret. Work to save Midwest distribution. The creation of LD Strategic. Yesterday's revelation to the Wilson family. When I finished, she took a thoughtful sip of her Cabernet before responding. You know, when you canceled our lunch 3 years ago to attend some Wilson family function, I had a feeling this marriage would either break you or force you to stand up for yourself in ways you never had before. Why didn't you say something? Would you have listened? You were infatuated with Mark and the whole Wilson package, the prestige, the social standing, the ready-made family network. You'd spent so long burying yourself in spreadsheets and client files, I think you saw them as some kind of shortcut to a personal life. Her assessment stung precisely because it contained elements of truth. I loved Mark. I still do, I think. I don't doubt that. But love isn't always enough, especially when it comes with conditions you can't possibly meet. Diane had never married, a fact the partners at Cranston alternatively pitied and admired. The question isn't whether you love Mark, it's whether the relationship you've built together is sustainable now that you've stepped fully into your power. That's what I keep circling back to, I admitted. I'm not sure our marriage can survive this shift. The dynamic was established from the beginning. He was the Wilson heir bringing me into the fold, and I was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity. Now that I literally control his family's livelihood, it's quite the role reversal, Diane agreed. Few relationships could weather that kind of transformation, but maybe that's the wrong framing. Maybe this isn't about whether your marriage can survive the change, but whether it should. The question lingered as we finished our wine, moving on to safer topics. Office politics, an upcoming client presentation, Diane's plans to finally take a sabbatical after 15 years of nonstop work. When we parted outside the restaurant, she hugged me with uncharacteristic warmth. Whatever you decide, remember that you built your success through your own talent and effort. The Wilsons may own the name on the company, but you created its current value. Don't let anyone diminish that, especially not yourself. Sunday morning, I woke to the sound of a key in the front door. Mark entered our condo cautiously, as if unsure of his welcome in what had always been more his space than mine, despite both our names on the deed. "You're here," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Where else would I be?" "I don't know. When you didn't answer any calls?" He set down a bag from our favorite bakery, an obvious peace offering. "I thought maybe you'd left. Unlike some people, I don't abandon ship when the conversation gets difficult." The words came out sharper than intended, old hurts rising to the surface. Mark winced. I deserved that. I needed time to process everything, to figure out where we go from here. "And did you figure it out?" He moved to the kitchen, busying himself with plates and coffee to avoid meeting my eyes directly. "I've been staying at Brian's. We talked a lot. About the company, about what you've done, about how none of us saw it. I wasn't exactly hiding my abilities," I pointed out. "Just their specific application to Midwest distribution." "I know. That's what makes it worse." He finally looked at me directly. "You've been a partner at Cranston for over a year. You turn failing companies around for a living. Yet, somehow, I never connected that expertise to our family business because you compartmentalized me," I finished for him. Professional Laura existed in one box, Wilson wife Laura in another, and never the twain shall meet. "It wasn't conscious," he protested. "That makes it worse, not better. It was so ingrained you didn't even realize you were doing it." We settled. At the dining table, the pastries between us untouched. Mark looked tired, his usually perfect appearance slightly rumpled. For the first time, I noticed strands of gray at his temples that hadn't been there when we met. "Dad wants to meet with you," he said finally. "Privately, without the rest of the family." "What about your mother?" "Mom's struggling. This has been a lot for her to process." He picked at a croissant without actually eating it. "You have to understand, her entire identity is built around being the Wilson family matriarch. Finding out that the company supporting that identity has actually been under your control is exactly the wake-up call she needed," I finished. "Your mother has treated me like an interloper from day one, Mark. She's made it clear that no matter what I accomplish professionally, my only real value would be producing the next generation of Wilson heirs." He didn't deny it. "She comes from a different generation. Her mother was the same way with Dad's mother. It's just how things have always been done in families like ours. That's the problem. Families like ours. From the beginning, it's been your family that I was allowed to orbit but never fully join. Even you refer to it as our family business, when legally speaking, it's more mine than yours at this point." The truth of this hung between us, undeniable and uncomfortable. Mark had always defined himself as a Wilson first, an individual second. His identity was inseparable from the family legacy. Now that legacy rested in my hands, disrupting the very foundation of how he saw himself in the world. "What do you want, Laura? Really want?" he asked finally. "Do you want to run Midwest distribution permanently? Do you want to sell it? Do you want to stay married? I'm trying to understand where we go from here." It was the first time in our relationship he'd asked about my desires without subtly framing them within the context of Wilson expectations. Progress, however small. "I want what I've always wanted: recognition for my abilities and contributions, respect as a professional, and as a person. A marriage that's an actual partnership, not a constant exercise in trying to fit a mold that was never designed for me." "And the company?" "Midwest distribution has potential that George never fully explored. The logistics infrastructure could be leveraged in ways that go beyond your traditional client base. I've already begun implementing changes that will increase valuation by at least 20% over the next fiscal year." Mark stared at me, a hint of admiration breaking through his confusion. "You really do know the business inside and out. Better than anyone except maybe Brian. Your father built something impressive, but he stopped innovating a decade ago. Your brother saw the warning signs but lacked the authority to make necessary changes. And you never took enough interest to understand what was happening," he finished, a flush of embarrassment coloring his face. Client relations was always a glorified title. Dad gave me the job because I'm good with people, not because I understand logistics or finance. The admission surprised me. Mark had always portrayed himself as a crucial part of the Wilson business, his role essential to its operation. To hear him acknowledge the truth of his position was unexpected. "When did you realize the company was in trouble?" I asked. "I didn't, not really." He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it further. "Brian tried to talk to me about cash flow problems and the Wisconsin expansion risks, but I assumed he was being his usual cautious self. Dad always said Brian lacked vision. That business required bold moves. Sometimes the most visionary move is recognizing when to change course," I said. "Brian understood that before your father did. It's why he came to Cranston in the first place." "And found you." A small smile touched Mark's lips. "The irony isn't lost on me. If he'd chosen any other consultant at your firm, but he didn't. He specifically requested me based on my work with similar companies. He recognized skills that his own brother, my husband, never seemed to notice." The smile faded. "That's fair. I've never given your career the attention or respect it deserved. I just didn't. It wasn't what you were raised to value in a wife," I concluded. "I know." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 3 years of misaligned expectations pressing down between us. "Will you meet with Dad?" Mark asked eventually. "Yes, but not at Winnetka, not on Wilson territory. Monday afternoon at my office, after I've met with the executive team." He nodded, accepting the boundary. "And us? Should I stay here tonight?" The question caught me off guard. Despite everything, I hadn't actually considered the logistics of separation, the physical unwinding of our shared life. Our condo suddenly seemed too small, too full of overlapping memories and competing claims. "I think we need space," I said finally. "Not necessarily permanent space, but enough to figure out who we are individually before we can decide who we might be together." Relief and sadness crossed his face in equal measure. "I'll pack some things." As he moved toward our bedroom, I called after him. "Mark, for what it's worth, I didn't do any of this to hurt you or your family. I honestly thought I was helping." He paused in the doorway. "I know. That's what makes this so complicated. If you'd been secretly plotting our downfall, it would be easier to walk away. But you weren't. You were saving us from ourselves while we treated you like you didn't matter. And now we all have to live with the truth and decide if we're capable of change." After Mark left with a suitcase and a subdued goodbye, I spent the afternoon preparing for Monday's meetings. The executive team at Midwest Distribution needed clear direction amid the family chaos. The company couldn't afford operational disruption while the Wilsons processed their new reality. By evening, the emotional weight of the weekend caught up with me. I ran a bath, something I rarely took time for, and sank into the hot water with a glass of wine balanced on the edge of the tub. As steam clouded the bathroom mirror, I studied my reflection in fragments. A woman I recognized professionally, but had somehow lost touch with personally over the years of Wilson compromise. When had I started dressing to meet Susan's approval, rather than my own taste? When had I begun filtering my opinions through the lens of Wilson acceptability? The changes had been so gradual, each small concession barely noticeable until they accumulated into a version of myself I hardly recognized, outside the office. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that had been missing for months. I dressed with particular care. A charcoal suit that projected authority without apology. Minimal jewelry except for a pair of sapphire earrings my grandmother had left me. Hair pulled back in a simple knot. Professional, powerful, and distinctly not styled to Wilson's specifications. The executive offices of Midwest Distribution hummed with nervous energy when I arrived. Word had clearly spread about Friday's revelation. Employees watched me cross the lobby with undisguised curiosity, whispers following in my wake. Brian met me at the elevator, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd slept as poorly as I had. "Everyone's assembled in the conference room," he said without preamble. The executive team, department heads, regional managers calling in virtually. "And your father?" "Arriving separately for your private meeting at 2. Brian studied me as we rode the elevator in silence. "You look different." "I feel different." "Mark stayed with me all weekend," he offered. "He's taking this hard." "We all are." I kept my tone neutral, unwilling to make Brian a confidant in my marital issues when his own position remained complicated. "Let's focus on the company today. Personal matters can wait." The conference room fell silent as we entered, 24 faces turning toward me with expressions ranging from apprehension to curiosity. Most of these people had known me only as Mark Wilson's wife on the rare occasions I attended company functions. Today, they would meet Laura Davis, controlling partner of Midwest Distribution Solutions. "Good morning," I began, taking the seat at the head of the table that had traditionally belonged to George. "I appreciate you all adjusting your schedules on short notice. We have a lot to cover." For the next hour, I methodically outlined the company's current position, future initiatives, and the management structure going forward. I answered questions directly, demonstrated intimate knowledge of operations that surprised even long-term employees, and made it clear that while the company name wouldn't change, its direction and leadership most certainly would. "To address the elephant in the room," I said as we neared the end of the meeting, "yes, this represents a significant shift in how Midwest Distribution will operate. Yes, the Wilson family will remain involved, but in restructured roles that better align with individual strengths. And no, these changes do not signal instability or upcoming reductions. If anything, we're positioning for aggressive growth." A logistics manager who'd been with the company for 20 years raised his hand. "With all due respect, Ms. Davis, we've operated as a family business for 3 decades. How can we be sure these changes won't undermine the culture that's made Midwest successful?" It was a fair question, one that acknowledged the genuine strengths of the Wilson approach alongside its limitations. "Culture isn't static," I replied. "The most successful elements of Midwest's operations, the personal attention to client relationships, the emphasis on employee retention, the commitment to the communities we serve, those will absolutely continue. But we'll be adding greater efficiency, technological innovation, and expanded service offerings that allow us to compete more effectively in a changing market." By the time the meeting concluded, the atmosphere had shifted from anxiety to cautious optimism. I'd made no promises I couldn't keep, outlined clear next steps, and demonstrated competence that transcended my connection to the Wilson name. As the room cleared, several executives lingered to introduce themselves properly, their manner notably different from our previous interactions at company holiday parties. Brian remained after everyone else had gone, gathering papers with methodical precision. "That went better than I expected," he admitted. "You know the company better than most people who've worked here for years." "I've had a lot of time to study it," I reminded him. 3 years of nights and weekends while maintaining my client load at Cranston." He winced slightly. "When you put it that way, it sounds like exactly what it was," I finished. "A second full-time job that none of you valued or acknowledged." "I acknowledged it," he protested. "I knew what you were doing." "Yes, but you were content to let it remain secret as long as it benefited the family. You watched your parents dismiss me year after year without ever saying, 'Actually, Laura's the reason we still have a company at all.'" Brian had the grace to look ashamed. "I thought it was what you wanted, to help without confrontation." "Initially, maybe. But as time passed, it became increasingly clear that the arrangement was Fundamentally unbalanced. I gathered my own materials, preparing for the lunch break before George arrived. You're the CFO, Brian. In what world does an arrangement where one party provides all the value while receiving none of the recognition make sense? He had no answer for that, and I didn't expect one. Of all the Wilsons, Brian had been the least overtly dismissive of my career. But his silence had been its own form of complicity. He'd recognized my skills enough to leverage them for the family's benefit, but not enough to challenge the family's treatment of me. I spent the lunch hour alone in what had been George's office, now technically mine, though I had no intention of occupying it regularly. The space was a testament to the Wilson patriarch's self-image: mahogany furniture, mounted photos of George with various politicians and business leaders, artifacts from 30 years of building a regional powerhouse. I studied the photos, noting how George stood slightly ahead of everyone else in each image, positioning himself as the central figure regardless of context. At precisely 2 o'clock, my assistant announced George's arrival. He entered the office, with less of his usual swagger, taking in the sight of me behind his desk with a complex expression. "Laura," he said, extending his hand formally. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "George." I shook his hand and gestured to the visitor's chair. Another power reversal that clearly registered with him. "Please, have a seat." He settled himself with the careful dignity of a man unaccustomed to being in the supplicant position. For a moment, we simply regarded each other across the desk, reassessing after years of superficial interaction. "I've spent the weekend reviewing everything," he began. "The acquisition documents, the improvement initiatives over the past 2 years, the current valuation reports. It's impressive work. Thank you. I'm not sure I fully understand why you did it this way," he continued. "The secrecy, the shell company, the elaborate deception. If you saw problems with how Midwest was being run, you could have come to me directly." I allowed myself a small smile. "Could I have, George? Really? Think back to our interactions over the past 3 years. When have you ever shown interest in my professional opinion about anything, let alone your company?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps I underestimated your expertise." "You never bothered to estimate it at all," I corrected. "From the day I met you, I've been classified as Mark's wife, with no identity beyond that role. My career has been treated as a peculiar hobby I would naturally abandon once I embraced my proper place in the Wilson family structure. Things were different in my generation," he offered, the standard excuse for outdated thinking. "Susan and I had certain expectations about family roles. And you never considered that those expectations might need updating for your children's generation? That perhaps Mark's wife might have value beyond her ability to plan dinner parties and produce grandchildren?" George had the good sense not to argue the point. Instead, he changed tack. "What happens now? With the company? With the family?" It was the most direct acknowledgement I'd received that these were now separate considerations. The business, future of Midwest distribution, no longer automatically aligned with Wilson family dynamics. "That depends partly on you," I said honestly. "The company will continue its current trajectory with some additional initiatives I've been developing. The executive team has been briefed this morning. As for your role, I see 2 options." He straightened slightly, businessman engaging with businessman. "I'm listening. Option 1, you stay on as chairman emeritus, a largely advisory position that honors your history with the company while transitioning operational control to the new structure. You'd attend key meetings, maintain relationships with legacy clients, and serve as the public face of Midwest's heritage while we build its future. And option 2, a generous retirement package, consulting fees for specific projects where your institutional knowledge would be valuable, and a clean break from day-to-day involvement." He absorbed this with impressive composure. "You've thought this through." "I've had years to consider the possibilities," I reminded him. "While you were dismissing me at family dinners, I was analyzing every aspect of the business you built. Something shifted in George's expression, a reluctant respect replacing his initial defensiveness. The company needs continuity. Clients who've worked with me for decades would be unsettled by my sudden departure. I agree. That's why I prefer option 1, despite our personal history. And Brian? Mark? He asked. What happens to them in this new structure? Brian remains CFO. He's good at his job when allowed to actually do it without interference. As for Mark, I paused, the personal and professional overlapping uncomfortably. That's more complicated. Because of your marriage, George surmised. Partly, but also because Mark's current role isn't clearly defined. Client relations has functioned as a catch-all for activities that don't fit elsewhere. In a more structured organization, his responsibilities need better definition. George nodded slowly. My son has many strengths, but organizational discipline isn't one of them. I gave him that role because he's charming, personable. People like him. People do like him, I agreed. That's an asset we shouldn't waste. But it needs direction. Clear objectives, measurable outcomes. You sound like Brian, George observed, though not unkindly. Brian understands business fundamentals. He just lacked the authority to implement them. I leaned forward slightly. Here's what I'm proposing, George. You take option 1. Chairman Emeritus with the understanding that your role is supportive, rather than directive. We develop a transition plan for Mark that builds on his strengths while introducing more accountability. The company continues its upward trajectory, and the Wilson legacy remains intact, if somewhat redefined. He considered this, years of business negotiation evident in his measured response. And what do you want in return? The question was refreshingly direct after years of oblique Wilson family politics. Professional respect. No more undermining. Comments about my career. No more expectations that I'll eventually give it up to fit some outdated family model. And a reset on how the family, particularly Susan, treats me moving forward. Susan may be the most difficult part of this equation, George admitted. This situation has challenged her understanding of her place in the family structure. I imagine it has. For years, Susan has operated as if her approval were the entry fee to Wilson acceptance. Finding out that the daughter-in-law she's consistently dismissed actually controls the family's financial future must be quite the adjustment. George almost smiled, a brief, surprising glimpse of self-awareness I hadn't expected from him. My wife has strong opinions about what makes a proper Wilson spouse. Opinions that have made me feel perpetually inadequate despite objectively stellar professional accomplishments, I pointed out. That ends now, George. I won't demand warmth or friendship from Susan, but basic respect is non-negotiable moving forward. He studied me with newfound attention, as if truly seeing me for the first time. You know, you remind me of myself 30 years ago. When I started this company, everyone said it wouldn't work. Too ambitious, too aggressive in a crowded market. No one took me seriously until I forced them to. The comparison surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Beneath our obvious differences, George and I shared a certain determination, a refusal to accept limitations others tried to impose. There's a difference, I noted. You built your company openly, with full credit for your achievements. I built mine in the shadows while being treated as an accessory to the family that benefited from my work. Fair point. He extended his hand across the desk. I accept your terms, Laura. Chairman Emeritus, transition plan for Mark, and a reset. On family dynamics, we have a deal. We shook hands, the gesture carrying weight beyond the business arrangement. For the first time since entering the Wilson orbit, I felt George seeing me as a genuine equal, not his son's wife, not a temporary distraction from proper family duties, but a businesswoman whose accomplishments commanded respect. As he rose to leave, George paused at the door. For what it's worth, I was wrong about you. We all were, especially Susan. It wasn't quite an apology, but from George Wilson, it was close enough. Thank you for saying that, I replied. It matters. After he left, I remained at the desk, processing the conversation. One pivotal Wilson family member engaged with new understanding, others still to navigate. Progress, if incremental. The business path forward was clearer than the personal one, but for the first time in years, both seemed to contain possibilities beyond endurance and compromise. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Can we talk tonight? I stared at the message, weighing the timing, the readiness, the capacity for change on both sides. Finally, I typed, yes, dinner at home, 7 p.m. Whatever came next, reconciliation, separation, or something in between, would happen on new terms. No more diminishment, no more carefully managed expectations. Just two people deciding if what remained between them was strong enough to build upon, or if some structures were too fundamentally flawed to be salvaged. I packed up the office that had never truly been mine, nodding to staff members as I crossed the lobby. Ms. Davis, several greeted me, the name change subtle but significant. Not Mrs. Wilson, not Mark's wife, but a professional identity independent of my marital status. A small recognition that reflected a seismic shift in perception. Outside, Chicago's winter light was already fading, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city's architecture. I texted my assistant to cancel my remaining appointments, needing time to prepare for the evening's conversation with Mark. Some discussions required clear-eyed preparation, and this one would determine not just my marital future, but the kind of life I wanted to build moving forward. Alone or together, Wilson adjacent or completely independent, I would no longer be the woman who disappeared into the background of someone else's family portrait. That version of Laura Davis had served her purpose, revealing truths that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath layers of compromise and accommodation. But her time had passed. The Laura who walked out of Midwest Distribution headquarters that afternoon stood straighter, saw clearer, and expected more. From herself, from her marriage, and from the family that had underestimated her for the key. Last time. I arrived home before Mark, giving me time to consider the setting for our conversation. The dining table felt too formal, the living room too casual. Eventually, I settled on the small balcony overlooking the lake. Despite the November chill, the outdoor space had always been neutral territory for us. A place where difficult conversations seemed somehow more manageable against the backdrop of Lake Michigan's vastness. I ordered food from a neighborhood Italian place we both liked but rarely visited. Susan had once commented that their sauce was pedestrian, and somehow that had been enough to remove it from our regular rotation. Another small decision reclaimed. The apartment felt different now, my morning's rearrangements having shifted the energy from Wilson-adjacent space to something more balanced. I'd moved my books from the spare bedroom to the main bookshelf, hung a painting by a college friend that Mark had relegated to my office, replaced the formal dining room centerpiece with a simple arrangement of fall branches. Small changes that nonetheless declared, this is my home too, not just a satellite Wilson property. Mark arrived precisely at 7, bearing a bottle of wine and an uncertainty I'd rarely seen in him. Always confident to the point of arrogance. In social situations, he now moved tentatively through what had been our shared space, noting the changes without comment. I ordered from Salvatore's, I said, taking the wine and leading him to the balcony where I'd set up a small outdoor heater. The table already arranged with plates and glasses. I haven't had their carbonara in ages, he replied, a tentative smile suggesting he recognized the significance of the choice. Smells good. We settled into the wrought iron chairs, the city spreading before us, lights beginning to glimmer against the darkening sky. For a moment, we existed in strangely comfortable silence, serving food and pouring wine with the synchronicity of people who'd shared countless meals together. I met with your father today, I began, deciding directness was the only viable approach. He told me. Mark twirled pasta around his fork without eating it. Said it went better than he expected. What did he think would happen? That I'd fire him publicly? Demand he clean out his office while security watched? Mark's smile was rueful. Something like that, actually. Dad's never been on the receiving end of a power shift. He didn't quite know what to expect. He built that company from nothing, I acknowledged. I've never disputed his accomplishment, only his assumption that it entitled him to dismissive treatment of anyone he deemed peripheral to the Wilson legacy, including his daughter-in-law. Especially his daughter-in-law. Mark set down his fork, food forgotten. Laura, I've been thinking constantly since Friday. About us, about these past 3 years, about how we got here. I keep coming back to one question. Was any of it real? Our relationship, our marriage, was it all just a cover for your business maneuvers? The question stung, though I understood its origin. Of course it was real. I fell in love with you at that charity gala, moved in with you 6 months later, married you because I believed we were building a life together. Saving Midwest distribution came later, after I already saw how central it was to your family identity. But you never told me what you were doing, he pressed. For 3 years you led this double life, my wife at home, my family's secret savior at work. How is that a partnership? When did you ever ask about my work, Mark? Really ask, with genuine interest rather than polite obligation? I countered. The first time I brought up financial discrepancies I'd noticed in your family's company, you brushed it off as Dad's territory and changed the subject. He looked away, unable to deny the truth of this. I should have paid more attention. Yes, you should have, but it goes deeper than attention. It's about value. What you valued about me, what your family valued. From day one, the message was clear. My career was tolerated as a quirky phase I'd eventually outgrow once I embraced my true purpose as a Wilson wife. That's not how I saw it, he protested. Maybe not consciously, but you never challenged your mother when she made dismissive comments about my work hours. You never corrected your father when he introduced me solely as Mark's wife to business, associates who might actually have been interested in my financial expertise. You participated in the narrative, Mark, even if you didn't create it. He absorbed this, discomfort evident in the tightness around his mouth. And now? Where does this leave us? It was the central question, the one I'd been circling since the Thanksgiving dinner confrontation. Where indeed? The pasta grew cold between us as I considered my response. That depends on whether what happened Friday was truly a turning point or just a temporary disruption before we slide back into old patterns, I said finally. I won't, return to being the Laura who silently accepted being sidelined in her own marriage. I don't want that either, Mark said, leaning forward intently. Seeing you at that meeting today, watching you command the room, I realized I've never really seen you in your element before. It was like meeting a different person. Not different, I corrected. Just complete. That's who I've always been. Professionally, Mark. You just never looked closely enough to notice. He nodded slowly. Brian said something similar over the weekend. Said you're considered something of a miracle worker at Cranston, that clients specifically request you for the toughest cases. And you're only learning this now, 3 years into our marriage. I should have known already. The admission seemed to pain him physically. I should have been your biggest advocate, not just another person requiring you to diminish yourself to maintain peace. The stark acknowledgement surprised me. Mark had always been quick to justify Wilson family dynamics, to explain away behaviors. That left me feeling marginalized. This new self-awareness suggested possibilities I hadn't dared consider. If we were to try again, I said carefully, things would have to be fundamentally different. Not just between us, but with your entire family. I won't subject myself to another 3 years of Susan's thinly veiled contempt or your father's dismissive tolerance. They know that, Mark assured me. Dad made it very clear after their meeting. things will change because they have to. Change because they have to isn't the same as change because it's right, I pointed out. I don't want a family that respects me only because I control their financial future. That's just fear disguised as acceptance. Mark reached across the table, his hand stopping short of touching mine, asking permission rather than assuming entitlement. Another small but significant shift. What would real change look like to you, specifically? The question deserved serious consideration. I looked out over the lake, gathering thoughts I'd been forming since that Thanksgiving moment of clarity. Recognition of my professional identity separate from our marriage. No more expectations that I'll eventually step back from my career to focus on Wilson priorities. Equal voice in decisions that affect our life together, not just the appearance of consultation followed by default to Wilson traditions. I turned back to find him watching me with unexpected intensity. And with my mother, she's struggling the most with all this. Susan needs to understand that her vision of a proper Wilson wife isn't universal law. Her expectations worked for her generation and her choices. They don't work for me, and continuing to measure me against that standard will only damage whatever relationship might be possible between us. She's trying, Mark offered. After Dad talked to her, she actually asked to see your partnership announcement from Cranston. Said she wanted to understand what you actually do. The image of Susan Wilson studying my professional accomplishments with anything resembling interest was almost comical in its unlikelihood. That's a start, I suppose. It's more than that, Mark insisted. For Mom, it's practically a revolution. She called Stephanie afterwards and told her she might have misjudged certain aspects of Laura's choices. Stephanie nearly dropped the phone. Despite myself, I smiled. Susan admitting even the possibility of misjudgment was indeed revolutionary. Small steps. So where does that leave us? Mark asked again, vulnerability evident in the question. Our marriage? Our home? Are we separated? Trying again? What? The directness was refreshing after years of Wilson obliqueness, where difficult topics were addressed through layers of implication rather than honest conversation. Another shift that suggested genuine change might be possible. I think we need a reset, I said carefully. Not separated exactly, but not immediately back to normal either. I've taken the guest room for now. We both need space to figure out who we are in this new reality before we can determine who we might be together. He nodded, disappointment. Visible, but acceptance there too. That's fair. More than fair, given everything. And professionally, I continued, we need clear boundaries. At work, I'm not your wife. I'm the controlling partner of Midwest Distribution. Those roles need separation for both our sakes. Agreed. He hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about my position at the company. Client relations has always been nebulous, more about my name than my actual contribution. This self-awareness was another surprise. The Mark Wilson I'd married had never questioned his place in the family business, had accepted his ill-defined role as natural birthright. What are you suggesting? I'd like to earn my position, he said simply. Define actual responsibilities, measurable outcomes like you mentioned to Dad. Maybe focus on business development for the new service lines you're planning. I have a good network that could be leveraged more strategically. The proposal showed thought, a genuine attempt to align his strengths with the company's needs without relying solely on the Wilson name, another promising sign. I think that could work, I acknowledged. You do have excellent relationship skills when you're operating as yourself rather than as a Wilson representative. He smiled slightly at the distinction. I was myself with you in the beginning, before I started trying to make you fit into preconceived notions of what a Wilson wife should be. I remember that, Mark, I said softly. He's the one I fell in love with. Something shifted between us then, a door opening to possibilities that had seemed remote just days earlier. Not a return to our previous dynamic. That was neither possible nor desirable, but perhaps the beginning of something more authentic, built on clearer understanding of each other's true selves. We finished our meal in lighter conversation, discussing practical matters of the coming days, the scheduled management meetings at Midwest, Mark's belongings that needed retrieval from Brian's guest room, ordinary logistics that nonetheless represented a tentative step forward. As we cleared the table together, Mark paused, wine glasses in hand. "There's one more thing we should discuss. The Wilson family gala next week." The annual charity event was Susan's crowning social achievement, a black tie fundraiser that doubled as a display of Wilson family prominence in Chicago society. In previous years, I'd dutifully appeared in appropriately conservative attire, smiled at Susan's friends, and played the role of proper Wilson wife with increasing private resentment. I hadn't thought about it, I admitted. Given everything, that's happened. The family presents a united front at public events. Mark recited the Wilson mantra with a self-awareness that made it almost a joke between us rather than a command. But seriously, your attendance would make a statement. About us trying to work things out, about your position in the family moving forward. Or I could skip it entirely and make an equally clear statement about independence and boundaries, I suggested, half serious. You could, he agreed, surprising me again with his acceptance of this possibility. But if you came as Laura Davis, partner at Cranston and controlling investor in Midwest Distribution, rather than as an auxiliary Wilson, that would send a different message altogether. The reframing intrigued me. Previous galas had required careful adherence to Wilson aesthetic standards, appropriate designer, appropriate jewelry, appropriate conversation topics. The idea of attending as fully myself, without those constraints, held undeniable appeal. "I'll consider it," I said finally. "No promises, but I'll think about it." Later, after Mark had gone to the guest room with a gentle goodnight that carefully respected our new boundaries, I stood at the bedroom window considering the conversation. Small shifts had occurred, tentative steps toward something that felt more like partnership than the unequal arrangement we'd fallen into. Whether those shifts would prove lasting or temporary remained to be seen. The Wilsons excelled at surface adaptation while maintaining underlying power structures. But Mark's surprising self-awareness suggested the possibility of deeper change, at least within our marriage, if not the broader family dynamics. The week that followed brought a strange new rhythm to both personal and professional life. Mark and I established cautious patterns of cohabitation, sharing morning coffee before heading to our respective offices. Occasional dinners where conversation increasingly focused on mutual interests rather than Wilson family matters, careful physical distance that nonetheless held an undercurrent of potential reconnection. At Midwest Distribution, the transition proceeded with surprising smoothness. George embraced his chairman emeritus role with more grace than I'd anticipated, leveraging his client relationships to support new initiatives rather than undermining them. Brian flourished with expanded authority in financial operations, implementing systems he'd advocated for years. And Mark, somewhat surprisingly, threw himself into developing a business development strategy for our planned expansion into specialized logistics services. The most significant shift came midweek when I received an unexpected call from Susan Wilson. "Laura," she began, her voice lacking its usual crisp certainty, "I wonder if you might have time for lunch tomorrow." The invitation was so unprecedented that for a moment I thought I'd misheard. In 3 years of marriage, Susan had never once suggested a one-on-one meal. "I have a meeting until 1, I replied cautiously. "I could meet at 1:30. "That would be fine." She named an upscale restaurant near my office, neutral territory rather than one of her usual haunts. "Thank you for making time." The courtesy, so at odds with her typical imperious manner, left me momentarily speechless. "Of course. I'll see you then, Susan." I mentioned the invitation to Mark that evening as we prepared separate dinners in our shared kitchen, another new pattern in our recalibrated relationship. "Mom asked you to lunch?" His surprise mirrored my own. Voluntarily? Unless someone's holding her hostage and forcing her to make social overtures to her disappointing daughter-in-law, I joked. This is good, Mark said thoughtfully. She's actually trying. We'll see. I remained skeptical about Susan's capacity for genuine change. It could just be damage control to ensure I don't liquidate the family business out of spite. He winced slightly. Could you actually do that? Technically, yes. The controlling interest gives me significant latitude. I softened at his concerned expression. But I wouldn't. Whatever happens between us, or between me and your family, Midwest Distribution represents people's livelihoods. I wouldn't punish the employees for Wilson family dynamics. Relief crossed his face. I should have known that. You've always been more thoughtful about consequences than any of us. The casual acknowledgement of my character, so different from the past, dismissal of my concerns as overthinking, represented another small but significant shift in our dynamic. The following day, I arrived at the restaurant to find Susan already seated, perfectly groomed as always in a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She stood as I approached, an unexpected courtesy. Laura, thank you for coming. She gestured to the chair across from her. I took the liberty of ordering sparkling water. I remember you prefer it to still. The small detail, correctly recalled, surprised me. I settled into the seat, studying her expression. For clues to this unusual meeting, Susan Wilson had perfected the society matron's mask decades ago. Pleasant, controlled, revealing nothing she didn't wish to convey. Today, however, fine lines of tension around her eyes suggested genuine discomfort. This is unexpected, I said after we'd ordered, deciding directness was the only viable approach. Yes, I imagine it would be. Susan smoothed her napkin unnecessarily. The past week has been enlightening for me. For all of us, I suppose, but perhaps most significantly for me. I waited, allowing her the space to continue without prompting. 3 years of Wilson family dynamics had taught me that silence often revealed more than questions. George explained what you've done for the company, she continued after a moment. Not just recently, but over the past 3 years. He showed me the financial projections from before your involvement compared to the current valuations. Numbers. Don't lie, I offered neutrally. No, they don't. Susan met my gaze directly for perhaps the first time in our relationship. I owe you an apology, Laura. A significant one. The statement was so unexpected I momentarily lost my composure. Susan Wilson did not apologize. Not to service staff who made mistakes, not to friends who felt slighted by social oversights, and certainly not to daughters-in-law who failed to conform to Wilson standards. I've treated you with disrespect, she continued while I was still processing. I've dismissed your career as a temporary distraction rather than the significant achievement it clearly is. I've judged you against standards that were neither fair nor relevant to the woman you actually are. The acknowledgement was so precisely what I'd needed to hear that for a moment, I suspected Mark had scripted it for her. But the genuine discomfort in her expression suggested these were her own words, however difficult to deliver. Why? I asked simply. From the beginning, you decided I wasn't right for Mark, for the family. Before you knew anything substantial about me. Susan considered the question with unexpected seriousness. The simplest answer is fear, though I wouldn't have recognized it as such until recently. The Wilson family has operated according to certain expectations for generations. Women in our family have specific roles, responsibilities. When Mark brought home someone who clearly didn't fit that model, you saw me as a threat, I finished for her. To established order, yes. She sipped her water, gathering thoughts. George and I built our lives on clearly defined roles. He managed the business. I managed the family and social obligations. It worked for us. When you arrived with your high-powered career and your obvious disinterest in society functions, I showed interest initially. I corrected, until it became clear that nothing I did would ever quite meet Wilson's standards. Susan had the grace to look slightly abashed. Perhaps I made those standards deliberately unattainable. It was easier than acknowledging that times had changed, that my son had chosen someone who represented a different model of partnership than the one I understood. The self-awareness was startling coming from a woman who had seemed constitutionally incapable of self-reflection. I wondered what conversations had occurred between her and George, what revelations had prompted this unprecedented moment of honesty. "And now?" I asked. "Now that you know I've been secretly keeping the family business afloat while planning charity galas to your specifications?" A flash of the old Susan appeared, lips tightening at the implicit criticism, before smoothing. Back into careful diplomacy, now I'm attempting to adjust my understanding, to see value in contributions I previously dismissed. It's not comfortable for me, but it's necessary. Because I control Midwest distribution, I suggested, testing whether this newfound respect was merely pragmatic self-preservation. "That's part of it," she admitted with surprising candor. "I'd be lying if I claimed otherwise. But it's also because George has helped me understand what you've actually accomplished, professionally, not just financially. And because Mark—" She paused, something genuinely vulnerable crossing her expression. "Mark loves you. Not the version of you I tried to shape into a proper Wilson wife, but the actual woman you are. His happiness matters to me, even when I've had peculiar ways of showing it." The statement felt genuine, perhaps the most honest exchange we'd ever had. Not quite friendship, not even particularly warm, but a baseline acknowledgement of reality that had been missing from all our previous interactions. "I appreciate your honesty," I said finally, "and your willingness to reconsider established patterns. It can't have been easy for you." "It hasn't been," she confirmed, a hint of wry humor surfacing. "George says I've been recalibrating my entire worldview this week. He seems to find my discomfort somewhat entertaining after 40 years of marriage." The glimpse of their private dynamic, so different from the formal partnership they presented publicly, humanized Susan slightly. Perhaps there was more genuine connection in their relationship than I'd previously recognized. "About the gala next week," she continued, "I hope you'll attend. Your absence would create speculation I'd rather avoid, especially with key clients and community partners present." Always the pragmatist, Susan's concerns remained firmly anchored in appearances. Some things hadn't changed completely. "I'm considering it," I replied, the same response I'd given Mark. "If I do attend, it would be as myself, Laura Davis, not as an auxiliary Wilson." Susan nodded slowly. "I expected as much. If you decide to come, I've arranged for Bergdorf's to send several options to your office tomorrow. No pressure to choose. Any of them. Just options." The gesture represented Susan's version of an olive branch. Not quite acceptance of my independence, but acknowledgement that her previous attempts at control were no longer viable. Progress, if limited. "Thank you," I said, meaning it despite the complicated dynamics still at play. "I'll let you know my decision about the gala by Friday." Our lunch concluded with cautious politeness, not warmth, but not the thinly veiled hostility that had characterized our previous interactions. As I watched Susan slide into her town car afterwards, I realized we had established something unprecedented in our relationship. Mutual recognition, if not quite respect. She had seen me, really seen me perhaps for the first time, and I had glimpsed the woman beneath the Wilson matriarch facade, insecure and adjusting to shifting realities like anyone else. That evening, I shared the lunch conversation with Mark as we cooked dinner together, another small domestic reconnection that felt simultaneously familiar and entirely new. "She actually apologized?" he asked, genuine astonishment in his voice as he chopped vegetables at the kitchen island. "Mom doesn't apologize. Ever. Dad says the last time she admitted being wrong about anything was 1987, and even then it was qualified. It was qualified this time, too, I acknowledged, stirring a sauce that was decidedly not from Susan Wilson's approved recipe collection. But it felt sincere within her capabilities. That's huge, Mark said thoughtfully. Especially coming from Mom. She's been practically vibrating with tension since Friday's revelation. Dad said she reorganized the entire linen closet at 3 in the morning on Sunday. The image of perfect Susan Wilson stress-cleaning linens in the middle of the night humanized her further. She's worried about appearances at the gala. Of course she is. Mark's smile held fond exasperation rather than criticism. Mom measures her success by what the ladies' auxiliary thinks. But the fact that she's accommodating your terms instead of insisting on hers, that's revolution-level change in Wilson. World. Small steps, I reminded him, though I couldn't help returning his smile. Working lunch with your father, awkward meal with your mother. I feel like I'm conducting diplomatic relations rather than figuring out family dynamics. Maybe that's exactly what it is. Diplomacy between separate powers rather than assimilation of one into the other. Mark transferred the vegetables into the sizzling pan. Which reminds me, Stephanie called today. She wants to meet for coffee tomorrow. The full Wilson diplomatic corps is mobilizing, I observed dryly. Should I expect Brian next? Perhaps? A formal embassy from Grandmother Wilson? Grandma Maggie would probably just tell everyone to stop being ridiculous and move forward, Mark laughed. She never did have patience for family drama. The easy reference to his grandmother, a family stalwart I'd met only at formal occasions, reminded me how much Wilson history existed beyond my 3-year window into their world. Generations of expectations, traditions, and unspoken rules that shaped even seemingly independent decisions. Do you think this can work? I asked suddenly, the question emerging from thoughts I'd been processing all week. Not just us, but this whole recalibration. Your family accepting me as I actually am rather than who they wanted me to be. Me finding a place within the Wilson structure without losing myself in it. Mark considered the question with unexpected seriousness, setting down his cooking utensils to give me his full attention. I think it can work if we all want it to work. If the past week has shown anything, it's that the Wilsons adapt when necessary. Not gracefully, not without resistance, but we do adapt. And us? I pressed. Mark and Laura, beyond the Wilson context? He moved closer, cautious but intentional. I think we're seeing each other clearly for perhaps the first time since those early months of dating. I'm certainly seeing you more, completely, than I ever allowed myself to before. The question is, whether you can forgive me for taking so long to look properly. The vulnerability in the question struck me, so different from the casual confidence that had characterized our relationship. Mark Wilson uncertain. Mark Wilson asking rather than assuming. These represented shifts as significant as any business transfer. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right framework, I said thoughtfully. It's more about whether we can build something new with clear-eyed understanding of who we both actually are. I don't want to be married to Mark Wilson, scion of Chicago, business royalty. I want partnership with the man who laughs at terrible movies and secretly reads poetry and cares deeply about things he pretends don't matter. Something shifted in his expression, recognition kindling. And I don't want to be married to Laura Davis, Wilson wife. I want the woman who transforms failing businesses through sheer intelligence and determination, who notices details everyone else misses, who maintained her integrity even while navigating the Wilson labyrinth. The acknowledgement of my complete self, not just the professionally successful parts but the core values that had guided my choices, felt like oxygen after years of careful breathing. For a moment, we stood in the kitchen regarding each other, with new clarity, the pasta sauce bubbling forgotten on the stove. We're burning dinner, I said finally, breaking the moment but not the connection. Worth it, Mark replied, but moved to rescue the sauce anyway. We ate at the small kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, another subtle reclamation of space and routine. The conversation flowed more easily than it had in months, perhaps years. Discussions of work that included actual details, rather than polite summaries, ideas about the gala that acknowledged both Wilson expectations and my own boundaries, even tentative plans for the holidays that might accommodate both families rather than automatically defaulting to Winnetka traditions. Small steps towards something that felt like authentic partnership rather than prescribed roles. Whether these steps would build into lasting change remained uncertain, but for the first time since that devastating Thanksgiving comment, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that worthless might become the rock-bottom moment from which something genuine could grow. As Mark washed dishes later, a task he'd rarely undertaken before our separation, he glanced over his shoulder, with quiet consideration. "Have you decided about the gala?" I leaned against the counter, weighing the question that represented more than just a social commitment. Attending meant re-engagement with the Wilson world, albeit on new terms. Refusing meant a statement of separation that might not accurately reflect the tentative rebuilding underway. "I'm thinking yes," I said finally, "but as myself, not as a Wilson appendage." Mark nodded, understanding the distinction. "I'll pick up my tux from the cleaners tomorrow. I haven't decided what I'm wearing yet," I added, a small assertion of independence. "But it won't be anything Susan has pre-approved." His smile suggested this declaration was exactly what he'd expected. "I look forward to seeing what you choose." The simple exchange, devoid of tension or expectation, felt like a microcosm of our evolving relationship, acknowledgement of separate identities within a shared context. Not a return to our former dynamic, but the potential beginning of something more balanced, more honest, more sustainable. As I prepared for bed later, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in relation to the Wilson family for years. Curiosity rather than dread. What might a relationship with Susan look like if built on mutual recognition rather than one-sided expectations? How might family gatherings function if my professional identity were acknowledged rather than dismissed? What could Mark and I become together if we both showed up fully, without pretense or performance? The questions remained unanswered, the future unwritten. But for the first time since that Thanksgiving revelation, I felt engaged with possibilities rather than trapped in patterns. The woman who had been called worthless was finding her value reflected back not just in business success, but in incrementally shifting family dynamics. Small steps, uncertain outcomes, genuine potential. Not a fairy tale transformation, but something potentially more valuable. Authentic evolution born of crisis and clarity. Whether this evolution would ultimately lead toward integration or separation remained to be determined. But either way, the path forward would be walked with clear eyes and firm footing. The night of the Wilson Charity Gala arrived with a crystalline, winter chill, Chicago's skyline glittering against the darkness as if dressed for the occasion. In our bedroom, now tentatively reshared after a week of careful negotiation and redefined boundaries, Mark adjusted his bow tie while I applied a final touch of lipstick. "Are you nervous?" he asked, catching my eye in the mirror. "Not nervous," I replied, considering the question. "Just aware of the significance. This is my first public appearance with your family since everything changed." The dress I'd chosen wasn't from the Bergdorf's options Susan had sent, though I'd appreciated the gesture for what it represented. Instead, I'd selected a gown from a young Chicago designer, deep emerald rather than the conservative black Susan preferred for family events, structured rather than traditionally feminine, elegant without being subdued. A visual declaration of independence within appropriate, formal parameters. "You look incredible," Mark said, his admiration genuine rather than automatic. Another small shift in our recalibrating relationship. appreciation that saw me clearly rather than assessed my adherence to Wilson standards. "Thank you." I slipped on emerald earrings that had been my grandmother's, another departure from Wilson protocol where family jewelry typically came from the Wilson collection. "Ready to make an entrance?" Mark offered his arm with a smile that held both warmth and nervousness. As ready as any Wilson has ever been to embrace change. The hotel ballroom was transformed into a winter wonderland, Susan's impeccable event, planning evident in every crystal-draped detail. 300 of Chicago's business and social elite mingled beneath chandeliers, the annual fundraiser for children's education programs doubling as a display of Wilson prominence in the community. We paused at the entrance, the moment of transition tangible. Inside that room waited the entire Wilson ecosystem, family, business associates, social connections, all aware to varying degrees of the seismic shifts that had occurred since Thanksgiving. How we entered, how we presented ourselves, would set the tone for whatever came next. "Together but separate," I murmured, the phrase we'd settled on during discussions throughout the week. Not the unified Wilson front of previous years, but two distinct individuals choosing partnership rather than prescribed roles. Mark squeezed my hand gently. "Together but separate," he agreed. Heads turned as we entered, conversations pausing momentarily as Chicago society assessed the new dynamic. Susan spotted us immediately from her position near the main table, her expression carefully composed as she noted my dress, not disapproving but clearly registering the departure from Wilson aesthetic tradition. George approached first, champagne in hand, Chairman Emeritus smoothly fulfilling his public role. "Laura, Mark, excellent timing. The Hancocks were just asking about the new logistics initiative." The greeting was calibrated to acknowledge my professional position while maintaining social niceties. Progress from the man who had previously introduced me exclusively as Mark's wife at such functions. I accepted the champagne he offered, with a small nod of recognition. "I'd be happy to discuss it with them," I replied, noting Mark's supportive smile beside me. "The expansion has significant implications for their shipping contracts." As George led us toward the Hancocks, major clients who owned a regional manufacturing company, I felt Susan's gaze tracking our movement. She stood with Stephanie and several board members from the Children's Foundation, her perfect posture betraying no hint of the paradigm shift occurring within her carefully managed world. The next hour passed in a blur of strategic conversations, business discussions where my expertise was now acknowledged rather than minimized, social exchanges where I was introduced in context of my professional accomplishments rather than merely my marital status. Subtle but significant shifts that reflected the renegotiated understanding between the Wilson family and the woman they had once dismissed as worthless. "Your implementation of the new inventory system has been remarkable," Harold Hancock commented during our conversation, addressing me directly rather than deferring to George or Mark as he might have in previous years. "We've seen a 15% improvement in delivery times already." "That's just the beginning," I explained, outlining expansion plans that would further enhance efficiency for key clients. "The infrastructure investments are already yielding returns beyond projections." Throughout the exchange, Mark remained engaged but not dominant, contributing relevant client relationship context while allowing my technical expertise to lead the discussion. Our professional dynamic had found a balance that would have been unimaginable before Thanksgiving. Partnership rather than hierarchy, complementary strengths rather than prescribed roles. As the Hancocks moved on to greet other guests, Mark leaned closer. "Susan's been watching you all evening. I think she's working up the courage to approach." I followed his gaze to where his mother stood, perfect in midnight blue Armani, directing staff with subtle gestures while maintaining conversation with Foundation board members. The Wilson matriarch in her element, territory where her authority had never been questioned. "This is harder for her than for George," I observed. "He's adapted to the business reality, but for Susan, this challenges the social structure she's spent decades perfecting." You understand her better than I realized, Mark said, genuine surprise in his voice. I've spent 3 years studying Wilson family dynamics, I reminded him. Professional habit, analyzing systems to identify structural weaknesses and potential improvements. Before he could respond, Brian approached with his wife Melanie, both offering warm greetings that contrasted sharply with previous years' polite formality. Since the revelation, Brian had become an unexpected ally, our shared understanding of Midwest Distribution's financial realities, creating common ground that transcended previous family barriers. The executive team can't stop talking about the new initiatives, he told me, professional respect evident in his tone. Peterson in operations says you identified efficiency opportunities everyone else had overlooked for years. Your financial modeling laid the groundwork, I acknowledged, our newly honest professional relationship allowing for mutual recognition that had previously been impossible within Wilson family constraints. As the evening progressed, I navigated conversations with increasing confidence. No longer the outsider attempting to conform to Wilson standards, but a recognized professional with distinct value and perspective. Clients who had previously addressed questions to Mark now sought my input directly. Board members engaged with my strategic vision rather than limiting discussions to pleasantries about charitable causes. The physical space between Mark and me fluctuated naturally throughout the event, sometimes together, sometimes separate. Our movements no longer choreographed to maintain the appearance of Wilson unity, but flowing according to genuine interests and connections. Together but separate as we'd planned, distinct individuals choosing association rather than performing prescribed roles. An hour before dinner, I found myself momentarily alone near the terrace doors, taking a brief respite from the social dynamics that, however improved, still required careful navigation. The winter air provided welcome contrast to the ballroom's warmth as I stepped outside, Chicago spread before me in glittering panorama. That color suits you. I turned to find Susan standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the dim lighting. She moved forward to join me at the balustrade, maintaining careful distance while signaling desire for private conversation. Thank you, I replied simply. It felt right for tonight. It makes a statement, she observed without judgment. As I suspect you intended. A declaration of identity, I acknowledged, not a rejection of connection. Susan nodded slowly, understanding the distinction. For a moment, we stood in silence, the city's ambient glow illuminating our profiles. Two women who had circled each other for years without genuine engagement, now standing at the edge of potential understanding. The Hancocks were impressed, she said finally. Harold mentioned your expansion plans to George. Said they've been trying to get that level of detail from our executive team for months. The comment represented Susan's version of professional acknowledgement, indirect but genuine recognition of value she had previously dismissed. Progress. Within her capability, though still filtered through social observation rather than direct appreciation, the Wilson Foundation could benefit from similar strategic assessment, I offered, extending a bridge where previously I would have maintained cautious distance. Your educational initiatives have significant potential for expansion with proper, structural support. Susan's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise at my engagement with her philanthropic work perhaps, or recognition of the professional olive branch being extended. I would welcome your perspective, she said after a moment, the admission clearly requiring effort. The board has been discussing sustainability challenges in the scholarship program. The invitation represented unprecedented territory, Susan. Wilson acknowledging potential value in my professional input beyond Midwest distribution. Not friendship, not warmth, but respectful recognition that had been entirely absent from our previous interactions. I'd be happy to review the financials, I replied, accepting the gesture for what it represented. Perhaps next week, once the quarterly projections are finalized. She nodded, our tentative professional detente established. We turned back toward the ballroom, where Chicago society continued its elaborate social choreography beneath crystal chandeliers. As we reached the doors, Susan paused, something uncharacteristically vulnerable crossing her expression. "I've been married to George for 40 years, she said, her voice lower than usual. "All that time, I believed my contribution to the Wilsons' legacy was maintaining the social infrastructure while he built the business foundation. Learning that the business I thought secure was actually saved by my daughter-in-law, without my knowledge." She trailed off, the incomplete thought more revealing than any finished statement could have been. For perhaps the first time, I glimpsed the genuine Susan beneath the Wilson matriarch facade, a woman reassessing decades of carefully constructed identity, confronting limitations in her understanding of family dynamics she had believed she controlled completely. "Your contribution has been significant," I said carefully, recognizing the fragility beneath her perfect composure. "The Wilson name stands for integrity and community commitment because of your work. I didn't save the family legacy, Susan. I just preserved its financial foundation while you maintained its social architecture." The reframing seemed to stabilize something in her expression. Not complete reconciliation, but acknowledgement of complementary value rather than competitive worth. She nodded once, dignity intact despite unprecedented vulnerability. "Mark seems more himself these past days," she observed as we re-entered the ballroom, shifting to more comfortable maternal territory. "More engaged, less performative." "We're both finding space to be authentic," I acknowledged. "It's a work in progress." Susan spotted George gesturing discreetly from across the room, dinner preparations requiring her attention. With a small nod that contained more genuine recognition than any previous exchange, she moved away to resume her duties as hostess, Wilson matriarch once more, but perhaps with slightly expanded understanding of her daughter-in-law's place in the family constellation. Mark found me moments later, his expression curious. "You and Mom were actually talking, voluntarily, without visible tension. Establishing diplomatic relations," I replied with a small smile. "Professional respect, if not personal warmth. Revolutionary by Wilson standards." He offered his arm as dinner chimes sounded. "Ready for the next phase of the evening?" The seating arrangement provided another subtle indication of shifting family dynamics. Rather than being positioned at the far end of the Wilson family section as in previous years, my place card sat near the center between Mark and Brian, directly across from George. A visual representation of my new position within the family structure, central rather than peripheral, integrated rather than adjacent. Stephanie offered a genuine smile as I took my seat, another indicator of evolving relationships. Since our coffee meeting 2 days earlier, Mark's sister had demonstrated unexpected openness to reconsidering our connection, perhaps recognizing parallels in our experiences as women navigating Wilson expectations from different positions. "Laura," George greeted as servers delivered the first course. "Harold Hancock mentioned your proposal for the Southwestern expansion. The board will want a formal presentation at the quarterly meeting." The public acknowledgement of my professional role, delivered in full hearing of assembled guests, represented George's version of official recognition. Not an apology for years of dismissal, but a declaration of new understanding that carried weight within the Wilson ecosystem. "I'll have the projections prepared," I replied, accepting the gesture for what it represented. "Brian's team has already compiled the preliminary market analysis." Throughout dinner, conversation flowed with surprising ease. Business discussions, where my input was sought directly, foundation matters where Susan actually solicited my perspective, family anecdotes where my presence was acknowledged rather than merely tolerated, small shifts that collectively represented significant evolution in the Wilson family's perception of the woman they had once deemed worthless. As dessert was served, George rose for the traditional gala address, champagne in hand as he surveyed the assembled company. For a moment our eyes met across the table, a silent acknowledgement passing between us before he turned to address the gathered Chicago elite. Tonight marks 30 years of the Wilson Foundation's commitment to educational opportunity, he began, his authoritative voice commanding immediate attention. 3 decades of investing in Chicago's future through its most valuable resource, its children. The speech continued with familiar Wilson rhetoric about community responsibility and philanthropic legacy, George in his element as the public face of family values. But as he approached the conclusion, he departed from the expected script. The Wilson family has always understood that adaptation is essential to longevity, he continued, his gaze briefly meeting mine. Each generation builds upon the foundation laid by those who came before, bringing new vision, new expertise, new perspective that strengthens rather than diminishes what has been established. The statement represented George's public acknowledgement of changing dynamics, oblique by most standards, but revolutionary within the Wilson paradigm. Across the table, Susan's perfect composure revealed nothing, but the slight tightening of her fingers around her water glass suggested recognition of her husband's significant departure from traditional messaging. Tonight, we celebrate not just what has been built over 3 decades, but the new directions that will carry the Wilson legacy forward, George concluded, raising his glass. To tradition that embraces innovation, to foundations that support growth, to family that expands rather than contracts in its understanding of contribution and value. As applause rippled through the ballroom, Mark's hand found mine beneath the table, a private connection amid public recalibration. "That was for you," he murmured, indicating his father's unprecedented acknowledgement, as close to a public apology as George Wilson is capable of making. "Not an apology," I corrected gently. "A declaration of new reality, more meaningful in many ways." The remainder of the evening unfolded with surprising ease, dancing with Mark with genuine connection rather than performed affection, professional conversations where my expertise was sought rather than tolerated, social exchanges where I existed as myself rather than as a Wilson appendage, small victories within the larger transformation still underway. As the event concluded, Susan approached as we prepared to depart, her perfect composure showing signs of fatigue after hours of flawless hosting. "You made quite an impression on the foundation board," she observed, her tone neutral but not disapproving. "Caroline Mitchell asked if you might consider joining the finance committee." The invitation, relayed rather than directly extended, represented another small bridge between Wilson tradition and new possibility. "I'd be interested in discussing it," I replied, accepting the overture for what it represented, not instant reconciliation but incremental movement toward mutual recognition. In the car heading home, Mark and I existed in comfortable silence, the evening's subtle victories settling between us like delicate layers. Not a complete transformation. The Wilson family dynamics were too entrenched for instant reinvention, but meaningful progress toward a new equilibrium where my value was acknowledged rather than dismissed. "Together but separate," Mark said finally as Chicago's streets slipped past outside. "It actually worked." "For tonight," I agreed, tempering expectations while acknowledging achievement. One event doesn't remake 3 years of established patterns, but it's a beginning. He nodded, understanding the measured assessment. "What happens now? With us? With the family? With everything?" The question contained multitudes. Our marriage, still in tentative reconstruction, professional relationships being redefined, family dynamics in cautious recalibration. No single answer could encompass the complexity of our situation. "Now we continue building something authentic," I said finally. "Day by day, interaction by interaction, not returning to what was, but creating what might be." As our car turned toward home, our home, increasingly balanced between Wilson expectations and Davis independence, I reflected on the journey from that devastating Thanksgiving comment to tonight's measured victories. The woman called worthless had found her value reflected back not just in business success, but in incrementally shifting family acceptance. Not a fairy tale transformation, the Wilsons would always be the Wilsons, with generations of entrenched patterns resistant to change. Susan would never become my confidant. George would never fully relinquish patriarchal perspective. Family gatherings would always require careful navigation of complex dynamics. But something had fundamentally shifted since that Thanksgiving. Revelation. Space had opened for authentic existence rather than performative compliance. Professional recognition had replaced dismissive tolerance. And within our marriage, Mark and I were discovering the possibility of genuine partnership rather than prescribed roles. A beginning, Mark echoed, understanding the measured optimism in my assessment. Not an ending. As we arrived home, the night skyline reflecting across Lake Michigan in fractured brilliance, I considered the word that had sparked this transformation. Worthless. The dismissal that had finally forced confrontation with 3 years of accumulated compromise and diminishment. Sometimes the most devastating moments create openings for the most necessary change. Sometimes being underestimated is the catalyst for claiming genuine value. And sometimes, being called worthless is the beginning of discovering exactly what you're worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.